Quincy Jones had built more #1 records than most producers had built careers. That was not an exaggeration, and it was not mythology. It was simply the accumulated result of 50 years of work at the absolute center of American popular music. Work that had taken him from bebop trumpet player in Seattle to jazz arranger to film composer to the producer of records that sold in numbers that altered the economics of the entire industry. He had worked with Frank Sinatra in the years when Sinatra was at the peak of what he would ever be. He had worked with Ray Charles on arrangements that people were still studying 30 years later. He had produced Michael Jackson's Thriller, which had sold more copies than any album in the history of recorded music, and which remained the standard against which commercial achievement in the industry was measured. He had written arrangements that musicians spent careers trying to understand. He had developed an understanding of how a song was constructed, how individual elements related to each other across the length of a recording, how the space between instruments functioned as a compositional element as important as the instruments themselves, how the architecture of a production created the conditions under which a performance could become something more than competent, an understanding so deep and so technically refined that it had ceased to feel like knowledge and had become something closer to instinct. He no longer analyzed what he was hearing the way a student analyzes. He simply heard it, the way a master craftsman feels a flaw in a piece of wood before he can name what his fingers have found. He had opinions, precise ones, about arrangement, about production, about the measurable difference between a musician who understood structure and one who was working by feel alone without any underlying architecture to support the feel. He dispensed these opinions in professional meetings and in published interviews and in master classes with the directness of a man who had spent 50 years being right about the things he was certain about and had learned through that experience, which things he was entitled to be certain about. In the winter of 1991, in a meeting at his production offices in Los Angeles, someone mentioned Nirvana. Quincy was direct. "No arrangement skills," he said. "You can hear it. There's no architecture, just noise finding a shape by accident." He moved on. The meeting moved on. He believed what he said. He had said what he believed, which was always his practice. He would not believe it for long. The meeting was standard, a gathering of producers, engineers, and creative staff who worked in the orbit of his operation, the kind of regular session where projects were discussed and directions were set, and the general business of making records at the highest level was organized and managed. Quincy ran these meetings the way he ran recording sessions, with clarity, with purpose, and with the expectation that everyone in the room was operating at the top of their capacity. The Nirvana conversation was brief. Someone had raised the subject because the band was generating the kind of cultural noise that was impossible to ignore even if you had no particular interest in rock music. The way that truly seismic events produce effects that travel beyond their immediate context and register in rooms where the people present had no intention of paying attention. Quincy was not interested in grunge as a genre. He was interested in music as a structural enterprise, and grunge, from what he had heard in passing, did not suggest structural sophistication. He said what he said. No arrangement skills. Moving on, two of the people in the room exchanged a look. They had both been listening to Nevermind for weeks. They said nothing. The meeting continued. The day continued. Quincy worked until late, as he always did, moving between the different projects that were always simultaneously in progress in the various rooms of the operation. By 10 in the evening, the offices had largely emptied. The engineers had gone home. The assistants had gone home. Quincy was at his desk going through materials when one of the engineers, young, someone who had been in the room that morning and had exchanged the look, knocked on the door before leaving. He set a cassette on the desk. "Just in case," he said. He left. Quincy looked at the cassette. He looked at the door the engineer had walked out of. He set the cassette aside and went back to work. An hour later, he picked it up. He had a cassette player in his office, a high-quality one, because the quality of sound mattered even in preliminary listening, especially to someone whose ear had been calibrated over 50 years to hear things that most people's ears registered only as general impression. He put the tape in. He pressed play. He was not expecting to be interested. He was doing what he occasionally did late at night, when the pressure of the day had lifted enough to allow for the kind of open listening that the day itself rarely permitted. Putting something on without specific intention, giving it his attention as a professional courtesy to the person who had left it, expecting to confirm what he had said that morning and set the tape aside. The first song began. He listened. The structure was not what he had expected. He had anticipated the formlessness he had described in the meeting, the noise finding a shape by accident. What he encountered instead was something different. The arrangement was minimal, yes. It was not sophisticated in the way that Quincy understood sophistication, not layered or complex in the way that he spent his working life building layers and complexity into things. But minimal was not the same as absent, and the minimal had been arrived at through choices, not accidents. He could hear the choices. He heard the way the quiet verse and the loud chorus were not simply dynamic contrast for its own sake, the way the loud part earned its volume through the specific restraint of what preceded it, the way the silence within the arrangement made the sound that broke it mean something it would not have meant otherwise. He heard the guitar tones chosen not for technical display, but for emotional function. The distortion was information about the song, not decoration applied to it. He heard the bass moving in ways that supported, without announcing itself, the drums structured around the song rather than performing alongside it as a separate demonstration of ability. He heard architecture, rough architecture, instinctive architecture, architecture that had arrived through a completely different process than the one he used, had been trained to use, and had spent decades teaching others to use. But architecture nonetheless, the skeleton of something built by someone who had never studied engineering, but understood, through some combination of instinct and acute necessity, how weight was distributed and where the load-bearing elements needed to be placed. He let the tape run through to the end. He did not stop it. He did not skip forward. He sat in his office at midnight and listened to all of it, the way he had learned to listen, completely without the conclusion already in place. It was past midnight when the tape ended. Quincy sat for a while without pressing stop or rewind, listening to the quiet that followed the last song the way he always listened to silences after music. Not as absence, but as continuation, as the space in which what the music had done settled into whatever understanding was available to the listener. He thought about the meeting that morning, about what he had said, about the specific words, no architecture, just noise finding a shape by accident. He had been wrong, not completely wrong. The sophistication was not the kind he had been looking for, and the architecture was not built from the materials he recognized immediately as architectural. But the judgment had been formed too quickly, from the outside, from the general impression of a genre rather than from the specific reality of what was actually present in the music when you gave it full and undefended attention. He had done what he spent his career warning young producers against. He had heard a category instead of a song. He had arrived at a conclusion before the listening was complete and had then listened, or half listened, with the conclusion already occupying the space where the music was supposed to go. He was in his office at midnight and nobody was there, and he could acknowledge this quietly and precisely to himself without having to make it anything larger than what it was. The engineer arrived the next morning to find the cassette back on his desk with a note on top of it. 3 words in Quincy's handwriting. I was wrong. He stood at his desk for a moment and read it twice. Then he set it down carefully, face up, and went to find the other person who had exchanged the look in the meeting the previous morning. He didn't say anything when he found him. He simply handed him the note. The other person read it. He handed it back. Neither of them said anything for a few seconds. Did he say anything else? The second engineer asked. No, just that. They both understood what 3 words from Quincy Jones in his own handwriting represented. This was not a man who corrected himself casually or publicly or without the full weight of his attention behind the correction. When Quincy said something, he had thought it through. When Quincy wrote something down and left it somewhere for another person to find, he had considered exactly what he was communicating and exactly how much. 3 words were not a small gesture from a man who understood the value and precision of economy and communication. 3 words from Quincy Jones meant that 3 words were sufficient, which meant the 3 words contained everything. They kept the note between them, It was Quincy's business to share or not share, and he had addressed it in his own way, directly, privately, without ceremony, in the precise manner of a man who believed that acknowledgement required no performance. Quincy never mentioned the cassette or the note in any recorded interview. He spoke about Nirvana occasionally in later years, always with the measured respect that his ear demanded he give to something that had been built with genuine intention, even if that intention had operated through principles entirely different from the ones he had spent his career developing and applying. He did not evangelize about it. He did not tell the story at dinner parties or in master classes as an example of his own humility. He had written 3 words and left them on a desk, and that was the full extent of what the experience required from him externally. The engineer eventually mentioned the note in an interview published in a music production journal in 2005. A long piece about his own career, his years working in Quincy's orbit, the things he had learned about listening in that environment, about what it meant to work alongside someone who heard music the way Quincy heard it. The note appeared near the end of the piece, described briefly, without extensive commentary. The 3 words were quoted directly because they did not require commentary. They were their own explanation. I was wrong. 3 words from one of the most confident ears in the history of American music. Written alone at midnight, after a cassette played through in an empty office on the west side of Los Angeles. What Quincy had heard, once he listened without the conclusion already formed, was something that his own education in music had not given him the immediate language for. His training was in jazz, in film scoring, in the architecture of arrangements built from many parts that worked together in relationships that could be analyzed and taught and refined. The Nirvana arrangement was built from fewer parts, and the relationships between them were of a different kind. Not the relationships between instruments in an orchestration, but the relationship between sound and silence, between volume and its absence, between the restraint that made the release meaningful. It was architecture, just architecture that had been built by different people with different tools in response to different structural requirements, the way a medieval cathedral and a modernist concrete building are both architecture despite having almost nothing in common in their materials or their methods. Quincy had spent 50 years building cathedrals. What he heard on the tape was not a cathedral, but it was not nothing either. That was what he had gotten wrong in the meeting. Not the genre judgment. He hadn't been wrong that grunge operated outside his primary aesthetic territory. He had been wrong about the absence of intention, the absence of craft, the noise finding a shape by accident. The shape had not been accidental. Someone had chosen it. That someone was a 24-year-old from Aberdeen who had never studied arrangement, who had never been in a production meeting, who had built his architecture from the inside out rather than the outside in, from feel rather than theory, from necessity rather than training. Quincy understood the result without sharing the process that produced it. He wrote 3 words on a piece of paper and put them on an engineer's desk and went home. That was the whole of the public record of what happened in his office that night. 3 words, a piece of paper, a cassette on a desk. The rest was between him and the music and the midnight quiet of an empty office where one of the most careful listeners in American music history sat with a cassette player and heard something he had told people. That very morning wasn't there. It was there. He knew it immediately once he actually listened. Once he removed the conclusion and replaced it with attention. That was the lesson. Not about Kurt Cobain specifically, and not about grunge, and not about the particular qualities of the Nevermind recording. The lesson was about the listening itself, about what happens when a conclusion occupies the space where the music is supposed to go, and what becomes possible when that conclusion is set aside and the listening begins again, cleanly from the beginning. Quincy Jones had built a career on the quality of his listening. On one winter night in 1991, in an empty office in Los Angeles, he listened again. I was wrong. Quincy Jones, handwritten note, left on an engineer's desk, winter 1991.